Wait for it to pop up. There we go. Okay, so today we are going to provide just a little walkthrough of how to abstract royalty logic and some CPI related logic in our
Okay.
templates. So we're recording this and move these out of the way. I don't know why I can't move that. Okay. So I I guess to start I guess since I know you'll create both template version to import and on the front end, I can kind of show you a little of both. So I guess I'll just dive in.
Right
I'll
there
start
is
with
new, that offset subperiods. That's new. Never saw that before.
ah, well, this is the latest template available
Okay.
on NG Production. This has actually been there for a while. It's something that it's just an extra option for if oh here let me I think it's missing. There we go.
Ah,
I was going to say the label wasn't quite expanded, so it's useful kind of when you want to have sub periods that will start Jan 1st. Let me shrink that there a little bit. But yeah, so this is the latest, greatest template is there. I mean, there's some newer fields that I'm
mhm.
aware of that were added within the last couple of weeks. All these different sort of end of term triggers via months, or I guess a date, or the actual milestone.
Mhm.
um, but let me just scroll down here. So kind of what I'm going to focus on though is the how to kind of capture various royalty types and approaches and as well as CPI. So
Okay.
for royalty, we currently have, in general, to capture like a standard royalty in the template. Okay, I don't know why it does that. You would, underneath the term type field, we have these three options under this royalty category. To
Mhm.
capture a royalty, select the royalty. You enter, maybe it's like 5% of, say, gross revenue for the entire project. And so we have 9 different royalty types that do various things. So, like gross rev rent acreage, for example, you would choose that if you are applying a, an entity or a landowner's share of total project acreage as the multiplier for figuring out their percentage of a gross revenue, for example. Or we do it based on turbine production, like entities' turbine production share, or even a megawatt capacity share of a total project applied to gross revenue. And we also have the ability to capture when, say, an agreement has maybe it's based on turbine production only, and various other um, options. So we have a these have been based on just all the agreements that we've come across.
Mhm.
Um, so if there's ever, anything new that doesn't fit the list, just definitely reach out. Let us know if you come across any or if you have any questions about how to choose between these. And I I can also put together sort of a little cheat sheet if that would help, just to kind of help
That would be
understand
awesome.
what these mean, because their labels alone are supposed to be descriptive. So I can provide you a little cheat sheet with exactly what that means to help.
Cheat sheets are always
Um,
great for me.
yeah. I have to have them as well. So for this example, like just to continue, I'll make this gross rev rent megawatt. So this one implies 5% of gross revenue would be applied to, let's say this entity has 3 megawatts of capacity out of a complete project capacity of like 300 megawatts. So it would take that ratio of 3 divided by 300 and then apply that with a 5% to the gross revenue. Um, so then you still just kind of go with, if it's a quarterly revenue, you would, enter quarterly, or if it's annual. And I will point out, and I'm going to say this one's quarterly. I would point out that one thing to note when you're using, let me just do this. When you're using this royalty term type,
Mhm.
this will automatically set your um, payment essentially to the end of whatever period you choose. So by selecting royalty to quarterly, if I don't put an offset, that will say it's going to pay the royalty at the end of the quarter. So if I add, say, like, let's say the agreement says we want to pay it 45 days after the end of the quarter, I would
Mhm.
set it to quarterly and 45. And just by using that royalty term in the beginning, that will tell the software, hey, 45 days after the end. That's a little unique aspect to using the royalty feature. Um, if you choose any of the other types, standard term, assessment, or the base rents, it does not do that. So that's just a little tidbit to make it easier when you're trying to figure out how to select the offset. So let's see. So that's kind of how to capture a standard royalty. Now, and let me know if you have questions or if I'm going too fast. But in some situations, you may have a greater of a royalty and say a minimum payment. It's just a standard, um, let me just do a standard term, I guess, a standard minimum. Maybe I'll go like this to make it a little easier here, like that. For that, you would just, dump it into a greater of, so there's nothing that would really change. So let's say $1,000 or 5% of that royalty. Um, and I want it to be a greater of. So you just stick them both in the same group. And then depending, if it's the same sort of this. Now, note that in a situation like this, the offset, since this was a standard term, this will now kind of be the default that has always been, where if you needed to say 45 days after the end of a quarter for a standard term, for example, you'd have to add what, 90 plus 45. Should do it on the fly, but just to make sure, you'd add an offset. So for this one, it'd be 135. And in
Mhm.
this particular example, should align them to the same date and when it spits out a payment. So this is kind of when you have just a standard royalty and minimum, you want to decide each quarter which one is going to be greater.
Okay.
S- Um, so let's say I'll just kind of keep these in here and just go. Then a lot of times there's a true up though as well. So a lot of, at least when we've run into to many, there could be true ups, especially on operational items. Um, so for a true up, let me do, let's say you pay a royalty. Let me set this up a little bit. So let's say you're going to pay a royalty for grins. I'm going to keep it set to, I'll do like a 1%. Let's say this time I want to pay a royalty 1% of the entire project gross revenue. And that's a standard. It takes your 1%, applies it to the complete project gross revenue for a given period. And let's say I want to pay it quarterly. So again, this one would be set to whatever the schedule would be. I'll keep the same. It pays at the end of each quarter. Um, let's see. But then there's, sometimes there might be where you pay your royalty ahead of time and then you true it up with a minimum at the end of the year, or vice versa, where at least we've noticed where you could pay your minimum and then true it up with your royalty at the end of the year or at the end of a period. So for this one, I will do it with I've seen more where you pay a minimum at the beginning of a period, then you true it up with your royalty. So in this sort of true up, let me enter some info to make it, fill it out here. So I'm going to do where I want to pay my minimum, and it will be trued up by my royalty. So in a true up situation, you actually want to use you the way that it works with our logic for a true up is you will essentially set it up so that the software will look for paid payments. So let's say you pay a minimum $1,000. Let's say you pay that annually. You pay that in the beginning of the year or quarterly. Let's do it quarterly for a little easier comparison, I think. So let's say we pay minimum payment every quarter at the end of a quarter. All right, let's make it the beginning for ease there. So this one is, it'll pay a minimum every quarter of a year. Now the trick with a true up is when you want to put in a minimum payment, you have to set it as a base rent advance. Um, these two items are important for creating a true up logic because the logic looks for this base rent advance type
Mhm.
in order
Mhm.
to know, hey, I want to pay this payment in order to run the true up. So that's one thing to note. Um, so I set that up. So my minimum payment is set for $1,000 at the beginning of each quarter. Now to true up with the royalty, there is this royalty type field. And by setting it to arrears, that tells the software, okay, at the end, this arrears feature is what kind of clues to say, I need to look for these payments paid. If you don't set it, then it's just taking a standard royalty and applies to whatever schedule you have. But by using the arrears in here, it makes sure it signals that it's going to be a true up situation. Um, so that's kind of a difference between using these fields and not using this field. There are different types of arrears. These are based on, like, there have been situations where maybe the arrears needs to run and look at like every 3 months to run a royalty. Or we've had it where it needs to look at the each month or even just down to the days. So instead of like if there's a quarterly true up that needs to occur, but instead of looking at just a standard, like you assume a quarter is going to be 90 days, let's say maybe it needs to be really specific down to how many days are in each quarter, because maybe there's a leap year or something. And so you need to know, well, instead of 90 days, there was leap year, I need 91 days specifically.
Mhm. Mhm.
So there are some ways to kind of really get in there and Um, but most of the time, just arrears is what we found is used. Um, so this is setup I'm looking to see. Yeah, that's kind of the setup for a true up. Um, and I will say putting it in a group, depending on like different nuances of that setup may also be needed. Um, Still kind of trial and error on my end, at least, to be able to say which situations you use that for, but just kind of highlighting that you can also put that in there as well, just to help identify kind of which true up, what are the terms that would apply.
Right.
Um, so that's kind of a situation where you have you pay your minimum ahead and then you pay up with your royalty at the end, true up. Now, let's say you want to pay your royalty first. Just kind of keep it going here. 1%. I want to do it by acreage. So if I want to pay my royalty ahead of time, uh, keep it the same. I'll pay my royalty. Which one was it? Oh, there it is. Pay the royalty ahead of time. And then let's say I want to pay my minimum and true up at the end of the year. So I'll just choose annual, but I want it to be, because we'll see, if I want this to be 30 days, uh, what's 30, 400, 415 days, I think. Currently we have to, that's right, sometimes we have to put in, as though it'd be the end of the year. Um, yeah, so, and when this is the case, I believe if we still do, if we use base rent arrears or base rent advance, kind of either tend to work. It just depends on how you set it up. So let's say 1,000. I'll keep it going straight there. And I have found if you use arrears as well, that will help to kind of signal, especially if you have like a escalation.
Mhm.
Arrears helps um, to help align on the escalation to look at the end of the year. Because sometimes, based on CPI, for example, the agreement might state a specific year to start, or you skip the first year, and arrears helps to signal in those cases for this kind of a arrangement that it needs to look to, let's say you pay this minimum at the 30 days after a year, but you need to apply it for the previous year. So if you need to get the CPI for that year, you'll use arrears and it'll say, okay, I need the 2021 CPI escalation value, even though I'm paying the payment in 2022. So that's kind of when you would use arrears. Um, now, this one's adds a little bit more to it, where in order to align and get the base rent to pay and look to the royalty that was paid, you're actually this difference of column is very helpful. Um, check B. It's basically, similar. It kind of groups these together, but instead
Mhm.
of looking for the greater of, it's going to look for the difference of. And we set, it's a kind of a simple subtraction sort of logic. Let's see. And to keep it where it needs to look for, the royalty, you have to use the base rent term type as well to kind of signal, hey, you need to look for something here earlier that's been paid. So the royalty would be initial since it's paid first, and final would be saying this is what you need to compare it against. So that's kind of a little difference on setting up a true up where you have a minimum that trues up the royalty. You need to use the difference of. And if you have a true up where the royalty trues up the minimum, you use the royalty type um, feature. Um, and let's see, I'm trying to think through. So those are kind of like the high level of how to capture royalty information. The fields that I've selected in various situations are kind of the ones that are required to activate royalty calculations. And I will say as well for the royalty logic, any of them that do have to do with like megawatt capacity or anything related to wind turbine um, data, if you have, say, a minimum that it's not a standard term, but let's say it's, $1,000 per megawatt capacity. If it's part of a royalty comparison situation of any kind for your minimum, you want to make sure you use, even if it's, nameplate capacity, we do have an assessment field for that, but given it's part of a royalty comparison logic, it should be selected as WTG, because the value used for this will also apply to when the software is looking for a related megawatt capacity of an entity. So it'll kind of take that same assessment value and apply it for, this minimum payment as well as when it's going to calculate the royalty. So that's one thing just to kind of note there. Um, and I think that's kind of a high level. Um, I guess one other thing is, sometimes there may be a royalty that is based on production of like megawatt hour or kilowatt hour in some cases. For that, you'd have your dollar term, and you wouldn't need to, even though some agreements would say, base it on a megawatt hour, you don't need to put that in the assessment field for a royalty. Instead, whoops, wrong field. You would align it with the correct royalty type. So like in this case, entity megawatt production would be one, well, actually that one is different. Term rent, any of these that say term rent, these
Mhm.
would apply to saying, it looks to, instead of the gross revenue, it looks to the turbine production information or to just a total project turbine production, or sorry, yeah. So I think project invoice, for example, is one that would say, okay, I want to take $1.25 and apply it to the entity's share of their turbine production to the entire production total of the project. And so that would be, and I wouldn't have to put the assessment to say per megawatt hour in here. And that, trying to think, that's kind of like a quick, an overview, I guess, of how to kind of capture the different types of royalty scenarios.
Yeah.
So do you have any questions on that
No, it's
aspect?
no, it's overwhelming, but no, I don't. I mean,
It,
none that I can specifically ask to right now. No.
okay. Yeah, not a problem. It's definitely, there's a lot of little nuances, and it's kind of based on different scenarios too, because the agreements may say one thing, and I know we found there's a lot of agreements that have different nuances within them. So there's a
Yeah.
lot of different ways to kind of capture it. And we'll definitely, as you start capturing more of those in like legal manager and whatnot, we'll definitely help reach out if you need any clarity on what something means or what the type of royalties might be. Um, so let's see. And then I can show you, because you do sometimes as well do these in legal manager as well, correct? On the
Correct.
front end?
Yep.
Okay, so I'm in staging. Let me see. I'm just gonna do this in staging to kind of show you. It's very similar fields. Um, let me just grab, going on the fly here. And I'll just do that, I think. Did I miss something else here? Status, sound draft. Okay, this is the one. So it's gonna, I call 360. Okay. So similarly, um, on the front end, very similar fields. If I'm doing a royalty, it'd be royalty, let's say 5%. Um, all of the types are here as well. And the royalty directions, if it needs to be part of a true up or not. In this case, I'm not going to make it part of a true up. And, um, it's very, very straightforward on that aspect of, capturing a royalty, very similar. Let's see, looking to see if there's anything on this front end. Base rent advance, no. One thing to note, if you're trying to capture where you have like a base rent advance or arrears and you'd like to set, just set using that arrears royalty type
Hmm.
function that I showed earlier, you can select the direction, you know, set it for arrears, but then if I need that to be a base or an advance, it actually still sets it as arrears. So that's just something to note, just kind of toggle between the two to change that on the front end if you need that specific scenario.
Right.
Um, and let me see one thing here. Yeah, okay. And if you notice also, there's a feature just going along with, there's something that pops up occasionally. So under royalty, you notice there's no checkbox here. And then for a base rent, though, there's a field that says percent of prior year royalty generation.
Yeah.
And I believe that this one is where, if let's say there's a payment that needs to take, like the base rent is applying only, say, maybe 10%, it needs 10% of the previous royalty in order to calculate, or that's what the base rent advance would be, is like a percentage of the royalty. So you would select that, and then I believe it's just a straightforward, I have to check more on this one, just a straightforward value, and it'll calculate. And when it calculates, what it would do is it would take basically the previous royalty generation that was payment that was calculated, and show an output, whether it's 15% of that value. So that's kind of a unique situation in case that arises. I think there's maybe one agreement that we've seen that on so far that I'm aware of, but just kind of highlighting that's what that checkbox would do. Um, I think for as far as royalty, I believe that is kind of the overview of royalty on front end and template. So
Okay.
it's pretty much the same as how you abstract it on the template on the front end. Um, and I can jump into CPI now.
Hmm.
I'll use the same template. I mean, if it helps too, I'm very happy to share this as well once I'm done, just to kind of show you the different situations. Um, so for CPI, kind of jump in here. So let me quickly look here. Okay, so for CPI, I'll kind of clear this a little bit. So let's say, you have just a standard, uh, I'll still call it a minimum. So used to minimums and royalties. Let's say I have a minimum flat fee that escalates by CPI. And to capture the logic, we have the column P, Q, and R, as well as column L, that are very important in our CPI logic here. So let's say my term escalates by CPI. Now we do have a drop-down field, yes, no. And the rationale for this is if you say yes, that will kind of flag that there is going to be a CPI escalation. However, if you know the actual index name, like for example, I don't know if I pulled an agreement that has a CPI, but in the agreement, they would actually, uh, oh, well, this I'm going to pull an agreement here. Yeah, see, okay, in this example, for this particular royalty, it's, the minimum is increased by CPI. They actually list out the index name, so
Hmm.
CPIU, for example.
Yeah.
And currently in NG, we do have, we're actively kind of updating this CPI index with values that are provided by NG. Um, so in this case, since it says CPIU, we already do have that as an active index. So instead of, if you come across an agreement that says CPIU, instead
Hmm.
of saying yes, what you could do, just to make it more apparent, is the index is just standard. It's called CPI. You can actually put the index label in there, and then that will automatically link it as well to this index when the payment term is in the system. So that's kind of a handy little, if you know the index name, you can actually put it in there. But if not, if you don't know the index name, select yes, and that will flag it. And then either a new index will be created, and I can kind of show you what I mean by that as well. Just I know,
Well, why didn't you put CPIU if that's the name?
well, this is the name that we have it labeled right now in NG, and I can show you that really quickly. CPI, just to kind of give you a relation to what it's
Yeah.
going to look like. See the CPI right here. These are all the different uh, indexes, I guess you could call it, because, for example, Canada, we've done a lot with Canada and NG, and they have different indexes based on province. So certain projects have different ones because it's all based on which index they use. Because sometimes, even if it says CPIU, maybe it goes further to say, you know, um, seasonally adjusted or all seasons included or something like that, where maybe that wouldn't be the standard. This is the standard default CPI. So that's why in that particular case that I was showing you, uh, that's generally been how we know to link to CPI. So we're linking to this label. right up here on the tab, and that will tell the software that's the CPI index to use. And the way our CPI index works, basically, just kind of high level, is we take the actual index values and divide them to get the percentage that you would normally see on the index on like the Consumer Price Index Bureau's website. So that's kind of just a quick link to, if you know the name, that would be what you're linking to if you know the label. If not, definitely using yes will flag it and will help to figure out which one it might be, or if it's going to be a separate index, or if somebody else knows. I know for NG, um, there's some individuals who are starting to actually enter that index data themselves, like for NG on NG's behalf. For say like development payments, I think somebody's starting to enter those values, and so um, maybe internally, I don't know if you would be talking with them about if they ever, needed a specific index name, or if you have a way to kind of reach out on your end, since you will be abstracting for like legal manager aspects. Um,
I don't even know who I would speak to.
yeah,
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 no
it's
clue.
okay. So I mean, for sure on, how to get these done though is just selecting yes, unless you kind of know which index it might be,
Right.
would be a way to flag that. So let me see, I think I lost my place. No, 87. Okay. So for purposes, I mean, I'll keep it as yes then. And so that's saying, hey, we have a CPI. Then this escalator type is going to say when it gets applied. So there's a calendar year, Jan 1st, which means, let's say you have a payment that um, the COD date is June of 2020. So this, by selecting first Jan 1st, that would be telling the software, hey, my CPI is going to start escalating within the next year, basically after the next
Right.
Jan 1st. Um, so you'd select that to kind of signal that. There is a milestone anniversary that would link it more to um, like applying the CPI closer to the anniversary of the milestone. Um, and there's also calendar year second, Jan 1st, which this would essentially say, hey, my payment, my CODs in 2020, I don't want it to start in 2021. I want it to skip a year essentially and wait till 2022. And that's when it would start. So that's kind of when you use the second Jan 1st. And so if I keep it set to, this is the one, I mean, I've generally seen this one just kind of
Yeah,
starting
me
it.
too. That's the one
Yeah.
I've seen the most.
Okay. So, and then sometimes you have a min and a max put in an agreement. Um, like this one, what is it? Has a 4% max, 1% minimum.
Yep.
So if this one's pretty easy, you don't have to write the percentages, they'll automatically come into the template.
Yep.
So that's how you kind of capture CPI on the template.
Yeah,
Um,
CPI is a little bit easier for me than this royalty nonsense.
yeah, no, it definitely is a lot simpler to kind of
Yeah.
capture for CPI. And you can do CPI, you can use this for pretty much all of these, the assessment type, standard type, base rent. And I think I've even seen one where you applied to a royalty, like it was a dollar value royalty that needed to escalate as well. So it works for all of those. Um, so that's kind of how you do it on the template. Then I can show you how to here, because there are some features that we need to update the template for that'll be forthcoming for CPI, but there's some new little features here that I can show you on the front end for when you do it on the front end, making sure I'm staging. Let's see, I just set that 1000. So let's say you use this little CPI checkbox. Again, if you know the index name, you could select it on the front end. Let me see, I'm curious on the front end. Let's say 1 and 0. Curious what that's going to do. Yeah, so even if you don't know the index, just making sure the checkbox is marked. And I'm looking to see if Yeah. So that'll definitely clue in that there's going to be something there. Or you can always, select CPI as well if you know that's the right index. Um, there are these fields, the CPI calculation month. This
Hmm.
actually comes in handy when, let's say, an agreement says on every November we need to pull that specific um, data from the index. So you select the month. Sometimes it would be, I mean, I think we've seen where it won't say the month, it'll say based on the effective date month or operations date month. And so, um, like effective date month, you kind of would know from the agreement. Operations date, if, as long as it's gone operational, you'll know. If not, I, I think a best approach would probably be, uh, like if you know expected month, maybe selecting it just to highlight that it needs to be on a certain month,
Yep.
um, or even putting it in the description. So is one thing to note, the escalator type field, when you use the calculation month, you always use the first Jan first. That's just kind of its default escalator type to trigger that one. Um, and that's kind of how you set a specific month in CPI. I will note there's this little checkbox, prorate first CPI escalated payment. There's one or two projects that we know of where the agreement actually wanted the first CPI payment to also be prorated. So
Oh,
you would literally check that and it will prorate it. Um, it's very rare, I thinking, but we have seen it. So there's that option. And the these two fields are what will be added to the template in the near future, but for right now, it's not available on our templates. So you're going to have to, if it's something that for example, is going to need this, then like for legal manager, you can definitely do it on the front end. If it's in a template and you know it needs to be done, um, until we can get that updated template put onto our website, I mean, definitely, letting us know if it needs to come in at a certain month would help for when we do those imports to legal manager. Um, so think that's CPI as well. Yeah, that's pretty much CPI as well on how to capture it. Like you said, it's definitely a little bit easier than royalty. There's not as many nuances
yeah.
with it. So I don't know if you have any questions about CPI or anything in general.
No, I think the questions will come when I get an agreement. When
Yeah,
I'm looking at one and I'm doing it, that's when the questions come. I mean, to me right now, this is all theory because I haven't applied it, but you
yeah,
know, but I mean, I get the general overall. I just have to apply what I'm seeing. So
definitely.
yeah,
Yeah, and I can send you kind of a little cheat sheet of short sorts for,
that would be
what
awesome.
these mean.
Yeah, that would be
Definitely.
awesome. That would be
Okay,
very helpful.
great. Great. Well, yeah, hopefully just reach out if there's any questions as you approach or tackle some of these. So,
I will, and I
um,
appreciate you taking the time.
definitely, yeah. And yeah, don't the template, this is the latest version that is
Okay.
available. So definitely grab that if you don't have it yet. And that
I
should,
haven't been using that one, so I'll change.
oh,
Yeah.
definitely. Because
Yeah.
yeah, this latest template has, the addition of one of the extra royalty types in here. So,
Okay.
okay. Great. And this is being recorded, so I believe this would be put on the recording page at some point as well. So for you to look back at
Okay,
if needed.
perfect. Okay.
Okay, great. Well, thank you
Great.
very much.
Have a great weekend.
Take
You
care.
too.
Bye, Catherine.
Okay, bye.
Bye.